Welcome to another conversation in practical theology. I'm Eric Stoddart. I teach practical theology from a Christian perspective at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And with me today is Dr. Harrie Cedar, who is an academic, an author. Harrie's been involved in science for quite a number of years and is now a chaplain. And Harrie and I are going to have a conversation from our different Christian and Jewish perspectives as practical theologians about prayer. And as usual, these are unscripted. We've just started with a topic and we'll see where that takes us. So, nice to speak to you again, Harrie. Let me just start off with a pretty provocative thing. I'm not sure about prayer because I worry that it's a bit like magic.
Excellent. I would have started more or less at the same place. I would have said prayer is a very, very difficult idea in every religion, I'm sure, but definitely we argue that it's a very difficult thing to do. To pray, basically. What are you doing? What is it? What are you doing? Are you asking, for magicness into it?
Yeah, I've come in my past from a different Christian tradition than I am now. And that one was very much about an emphasis on asking God for healing for people, for events to happen fortuitously. And sometimes it was about getting the right number of people to pray. Sometimes it was getting the right sort of people. If they were particularly holy in their life, then that could maybe, the phrase was never twist God's arm. But there was a sort of implication there that God was asking, well, if lots of people pray or the right people pray, then I'll do this thing that you're asking. And I was never comfortable with that.
Right. So in Judaism, it's quite strange because in the really big text, the Torah, there's incredibly little about prayer. There's Moses prayed to God or Abraham prayed to God. You don't know what he said. You don't really get the gist of it. It's usually in a moment, it's over. And there's no sort of big things about we have to pray to God. There's one part that everyone knows. It says, you shall eat and be satisfied and praise God. And for us, that's sort of a little bit about what prayer is, praising or blessing. It's a lot about gratitude. So we have lots of different sacrifices, which were a sort of a prayer thing, I suppose. Sacrifice in Hebrew, korbanot, means to bring close together, not to give something up. So there was sort of a prayer idea that an encounter, you were sharing a table with God, you were sharing a meal sort of thing. But obviously after the temple has gone, they had to come up with alternative versions. And there are all these sort of prayers saying sorry and thank you and all the different ones, like the sin offering type prayers, are sacrifices. But now they're all replaced with prayers, basically. Some of them are a couple thousand years old, some a bit older, some are more recent. But what most people would say is the most important thing about prayer actually is gratitude. So even if you'd never sinned or did anything wrong, you'd still have the gratitude sacrifice or the gratitude prayer. So it's about gratitude and thinking about who you're praying for. You're not actually praying because God needs you to pray. There's nothing that says God needs you to pray. You pray because you need to pray to God, not the other way around. So that makes a big difference.
Right, that's a huge difference because yes. That was sort of circulating around in the old Christian tradition I was in. It's much more so in the Christian tradition I'm part of, where we have prayers that have been hundreds of years old. They've been carefully crafted. We either say them individually or we say them as a community in worship services, or we use them on our own. But it's about often expressing gratitude, often acknowledging failure, often acknowledging responsibility, and somehow articulating that taking responsibility sometimes.
For us, the word for praying, hitpalal, is from is a sort of tense of palel. It means to judge oneself. And so that's what you're actually doing, is you're judging oneself. And it gives you that time to meditate and think about and judge yourself, and against a sort of more righteous version of what you're meant to be, I suppose. So it's a reflexive verb, to judge yourself, which is interesting.
That's really interesting, because I don't think that makes prayer human-centered, but it does acknowledge our embodied. It's me that's praying, it's you that's praying. This is not an abstract business.
No, the prayers are basically because you're praying to a fairly personal God. So we say prayers 3 times a day, which say the fathers, and it starts with the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And we all say, well, isn't that the same God? Yes, but each one of us understands God differently. So Abraham has a slightly different version of God to Isaac, to Jacob. So we say the God of Abraham, the God of and the God of us, therefore. Each one of us has our own relationship and belief and way of talking to God. So we have scripted ones, but you don't have to do the scripted ones.
So is that praying to God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the others, is that about connecting with heritage and those that have gone before?
Yes, it's very much about that. It's a twofold thing. It's seeing that line of heritage where there's this God that, Abraham first recognizes, and then it comes all the way down to me at this moment, and I'm connected to Abraham at this very moment, which is a wonderful idea. But it's also to show that Abraham was just another bloke, and here am I also making prayers to God. I've got the same right to do that, the same right to think about myself and what I need on the planet.
It strikes me, if I'm using one of the set prayers in a church service, I'm often conscious that I'm probably meaning it quite differently than my predecessors in the faith, because certainly in the Scottish Episcopal tradition, a lot of our prayers maybe have come from Victorian period. Others of those prayers we've salvaged from the Middle Ages or even earlier. Often, certainly in evensong on a Sunday, they've probably come from an Elizabethan period. And I know that those people practiced their faith and thought things that I simply don't think, and don't understand God in the same way as them. And so I'm sort of praying with them, but I'm also really probably not.
Yes, I'm sure we're the same. We're using ancient prayers. Most of the prayers are coming out of bits of Torah or Talmud or rabbinic sayings or things like that. You don't tend to make them up yourself, because you just don't make them as good. But it's like the Torah, especially the early parts of the Torah, Genesis. It's like reading a Shakespeare play. It's always relevant, because these are always going to be humans doing stupid things and misbehaving and not quite getting it. And we haven't changed. We haven't quite got it yet. And so it's the same sort of foibles even now. And so prayers that you're asking for are the same sorts of things. Heal me, make this better, whatever. We still want those sorts of things. We have a whole lot of set prayers that also about ancient things, restore the temple, not desperate, but it's there. A whole load of very set prayers that we repeat. And we know what they're about, and they keep a heritage going, particularly when you're praying in a community rather than praying by yourself. But we have individual prayers as well. And we have a prayer for absolutely everything. And most of those prayers are blessings. So you wake up in the morning and the first blessing you say is the Modeh Ani. Thank you for letting me be alive this morning. And then the next prayer is in almost afterwards, is what's called the Yashat Sayah prayer. Everybody knows, we call it the toilet prayer. Basically, it's the one you say, thank you, there's all these ducts and voids and tubes and things that are open or closed. And if one was open that should be closed or closed that should be open, life wouldn't be sustainable. So we say that first thing in one. So a lot of it is thank you and blessings prayer. The blessing, actually, the word barach that starts the blessing prayer comes from the same root as the knee, as in to kneel down and be grateful to God for doing that for us. You're actually not meant to enjoy anything without saying a blessing beforehand. So it's like you're stealing something because you haven't shown gratitude. So even before a glass of water, you thank God that creates everything. You mutter a prayer before absolutely every piece of pleasure that you have, just because otherwise, who do you think made it? Where did it come from, sort of thing?
Now, you mentioned there knees and bending. How much is bodily posture tied up with prayer in your tradition?
I think it used to be a lot more than it is now. I think we tend to do standing and sitting. We do some bowing, not a lot. And on Yom Kippur, our Day of Atonement, we do a sort of flat out kneel down. We're really sorry. We're so sorry that we absolutely subjugate ourselves, just how stupid we've been, and say sorry. But most of the time it isn't. You can just stand up or sit down and pray. There's very few times you need to stand. We have one called the standing prayer that we do 3 times a day. But yeah, because we stood at Sinai when we got the 10 Commandments. So we don't tend to lie down, I guess.
Right.
I guess that's...
I suspected for all of us, we have different reasons why in our traditions we have different postures.
Yeah.
And there is something about kneeling in a prayer that, because of your body posture, I think changes a mental posture.
I agree. I think it's a shame that we don't, but we don't. We tend to stand or sit. And, people bow forward and bow, even when they're standing up, do bows. But yeah, I think there is something beautiful about that whole kneeling. And also I like the Muslim, the 5 times a day prayer, where they do all those movements. I think it's a choreography. We have a choreography when we're reading the Torah up on what's called the Bima, our platform on Shabbat, about how you get around and how you lift up the scrolls and things, but not so much that. And I think that is something quite beautiful about it. Engages the body and mind, and it's meant to engage the body and mind. Our whole, like I said, we have prayers about, that we say after going to the toilet. So we definitely engage our body and mind. Everything has a prayer for it. When you smell something new, it's got a prayer. When you see a rainbow, it's got a prayer. Absolutely everything's got a prayer.
How much does the book of Psalms feature these days in Jewish prayer? Because Christians, we've adopted it and use it in our own peculiar ways, and use the bits that we like, and we sort of draw a veil over the bits that we're not that keen on in the Psalms. But I'm just wondering how those feature in Jewish prayer now.
They feature hugely. So in the daily morning prayer, we have 3 times a day prayer from evening, because of evening. It was evening, it was morning day 1. So we do everything evening to morning. So we have an evening prayer, a morning prayer, and an afternoon prayer. We say that they're to do with the 3 patriarchs. Abraham is the morning person, actually. Isaac is the afternoon, and Jacob's the evening. But whole other thing. But we do 3 times a day. And in the morning prayers particularly, there's a whole load of psalms that you read before you get into the main part of the prayer. And on Shabbat, there's a whole load of psalms. And then there's a daily psalm as well for each day of the week. There's a psalm. So yes, psalms are huge. And when we do the new moon, there's a whole load of psalms. Every month we do just Hallel, which is just psalms, really. So yes, huge amount.
What about those parts of the Psalms that are prayers about vengeance against enemies and asking God to bring down all sorts of horrible things onto those that have opposed you? What do you make with those?
I don't think about them that much. I think about there's a context to it and a reception to it. And of course, I'm receiving it now in a different world, but there's still struggles and enemies and people that are vile to you and people that are nice to you and stuff, and you still think, oh, go on, God, could you just get them off the planet and save me the bother? Sort of thing. Everybody thinks that. I mean, we all pretend we're terribly nice and stuff, but so there's a humanness about that. The Psalms about, I want some help and I can't quite sort this out myself, and could you just step in and do something, the easy version rather than the diplomacy version. It's of its time, but there's still so much in it that is relevant that you can't just edit out the bits that you don't like so much. You have to deal with them, and we do a lot of dealing with stuff we don't like.
And I think I'm straight there with you in terms of, let's not edit these out, because they are part of our various heritages in faith. And I'm also really in agreement that this is in our mind. We might like to pretend that it's not, and we might even want to aim not to be vengeful. But if a prayer can articulate that and make us stop and think, goodness, I've just prayed that in a psalm, and was that the right thing to do, or what is that revealing in myself? I think in the church I attend in Edinburgh, there's an old iron cross. It used to be part of a crucifix, and it's in our memorial chapel. And the reasonably accurate tradition is that it used to sit as a crucifix on the butcher's wall down at the Grassmarket in Edinburgh, where the gallows were. And that was the last thing on earth that people who were condemned to death at the gallows ever saw. And some of our congregation back in the day may well have been victims of political violence and certainly religious violence in Scotland. And when I stand next to that little iron artifact and those prayers and the Psalms of vengeance and things, I put the two together and say, this is part of my own Christian tradition. It's not something I would want to be proud of, but it's sobering, and it makes me stop and think, how am I doing that today in other ways? How do I have to relate to other Christians, other believers for whom vengeance is still right at the surface? And it's a really it stops me in my tracks when I see that historical artifact.
I think there's a huge difference between Christianity and Judaism. I think people don't acknowledge that they are very different. We look at our texts as being literally the word of God, or definitely, King David or whatever, but we don't read them literally. So we read them very, very interpretatively. And so we have been arguing for 3,000 years what was said in the Torah. And it's a very small, thin book. And we still argue about the meaning and nuance of everything. And so we're trying always, we know there's more than we know. And there are other levels. And in prayer, you're trying to reach up from a sort of intellectual, from an emotional level or a biological level to an emotional level. It's service of the heart. Prayer is a service of the heart. So you're going from your biology or everyday life into, and that's all valid. It's not a terrible thing by your biological life. It's your nephesh. It's your breath. It's not your breath. It's your living soul. It's your nephesh. It's your biological living soul. Up into the next level, or run, we call it, from sort of acknowledgement into a more ruach, the breath of life one, and up into the neshama, which is your highest sort of soul level. You're trying to get up. And you're using the prayers to do it, and the prayers have other meanings to them. So if you read some prayers, or say, and opening the gates of Eden or something, and then you'll find somebody talking somewhere else about a Kabbalistic view of what this was and whether these are rays of light, and you've got to pick these rays of light up and why you can't do this and why you've got to say thank you for that. So there's a whole, it's not literally read. So it's always can be tweaked to mean something to you. Some of our our morning prayer, even if you read very quickly in Hebrew, will take you about 45 minutes if you did the whole thing. And so a lot of people just do, obviously, the most important bits, the Shema and the Amidah. But our Shabbat prayers take 3 hours. We start at 9 and we end at about 12. We're sitting there working our way through a particular book. It's called a Cedar. It's our daily prayer book and got all the prayers in. And it starts with lots of intros, then it goes into Psalms, and then we start to get you in the mood, the kavana, it's called, of being in the right intention. And then you get to the central prayers that turn up in every service, basically, the same ones. The Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one. That's the central prayer about loving God and obeying God. And then it goes into the Amidah, which is the standing prayer. Then you read the Torah, bits of the Torah, which turn up in a different book. This is a version of it, but there's lots of different ones. This one's called Etz Chaim. It's the Torah divided into 52 passages for each week, and a Haftorah, which is a bit from either Psalms or Ezekiel or Isaiah that echoes it, that has the same theme. And then you sort of, as if you're ascending a mountain, you're getting yourself into that spiritual place. And when you're up the top of the Torah, then you've got to come down because you've got to go into real life. And so we have a prayer called the Aleinu prayer, which concludes most services. So our services always go the same structure, with these sort of starter ones and Psalms to warm up sort of thing, to get you into the right mood to do Shema, Amidah, Torah, and then come back down and then go off and live life. Even though we have a prayer for everything, you still are meant to get to work and do things. Not on Shabbat.
Can I ask a very basic question about the language that most Jews would use to pray in? Would most Jews pray in their native language or Hebrew?
Most Jews, I would think, would pray in Hebrew. I mean, there is a tradition that the Reform and the Liberal had much more English in it, but I think they've gone back to Hebrew. And I know I've gone to all these different services and they've always been in Hebrew. So I can go to service anywhere in the world and it's in Hebrew. I remember the Catholic Church had a big thing going from Latin to native tongues. And I thought, that's a shame, because you're going to, one, lose Latin, and two, you're not so universal. Not, if I go to a service in France, it's not the same as the one in Italy. And there is that to it.
And as well as the community aspect and the trans-global bit, is there something different between praying in Hebrew and praying in a vernacular language?
Yes, obviously, because Hebrew is a very particular language. Most of the words are just 3 consonant words, and then you add in vowels to make it a present tense or a participle or whatever like that. It becomes nuanced. But because of that, we tend to look, when we're looking at, say, the Torah or a prayer, we look through where that word comes up in different places and what it means in different places, because it can, with little prefixes and suffixes, just change very subtly around. So we can argue what things mean quite sufficiently. I don't know if I've given you an example. The first 3 words of Torah, in the beginning God created, doesn't actually necessarily mean that in Hebrew. It can be in a beginning, because it's not in the beginning. And the word that they use for beginning also means first and head. And the word for created also means think, thought, idea. And so you could translate it as, in his head, God thought the universe. So you miss some of these subtleties, obviously, when it gets translated. And there's incredible subtlety. It's quite a small vocabulary, but incredible subtleties in it. And you can argue exactly. That's why you can alter law, or not alter law, you can redefine law. That's why they argue, all these different Talmudic scholars. It's very postmodernistic. It has the entire argument on the page, the central argument, all the commentators around it. And they tend to go with the last one. but they leave them all up there because they don't know what's going to happen in the future and which ones will be useful in the future. So all the arguments are there because there's always a subtlety that it could just twist a bit. And the same prayer.
Yeah, that's a really interesting conjunction of inner, interior, spiritual aspiration and intellectual striving. And that, certainly in my Christian traditions, the intellectual striving bit has almost been dissociated from prayer often. And that to me is a sad thing. What you're talking about sounds much more together. I wonder where practice and doing things beyond, postures for prayer, but practicing our faith in good works and things, how does that fit in with this conjunction of intellectual wrestling and interior spirituality? How does it all fit together for you?
I think it can't really be separated. When you're reading Torah, you're actually studying Torah because you're going to interpret it. Somebody's going to stand up and say what they meant about this bit, and do you think they mean? So every day you're meant to be studying Torah, and practice. Prayer is part of practice because when you say, "Are you a practicing Jew?" No, I'm an amateur. Is what I want to say. But what they actually mean is, are you actually doing the practice, as in praying and doing as many mitzvahs, the commandments as possible? But prayer is an enormous part of it, and the emotional part, and you can't separate the emotion, or you shouldn't try to separate the emotion from the intellect, from the body. It's all meant to be of one. It's just you're trying to not leave your body behind, but you're trying to elevate the most base parts of yourself into the higher parts, but you don't want to leave it behind because that's being dead. So it's very closely linked. It's closely linked in prayer and emotion and how you feel and your relationship to each other and to God. So
there's within the Christian tradition there's this idea of God answering prayer. Now that often gets tied up in my tradition with almost a shopping list at its worst. At its best, it's identification with other people. It's at its best, it's about seeking to support others. So it covers a whole range of things. I wonder what the phrase "God answering prayer," what does that mean? What does that mean for you?
Yes, I mean, people do pray wanting help, like, please make this person better. In fact, one of the first prayers in the Hebrew Torah is Moses saying to God, please heal Miriam. It's like 5-word prayer because he's just given him her leprosy. So we do have that. Obviously, we're in the 21st century. We're not in the age of prophecy, so we're not expecting quite such a close relationship. We do know that we are grown-ups and we have to live, according to the Torah, because that makes you healthier, basically. Living that life is a healthy life because it does mind and body and emotions and the planet. You're meant to care for the planet. So if you kept to the Torah, you'd be healthy, and gratitude and stuff like that. Answering prayer, I guess people say God didn't answer my prayer, I didn't get better or something. I think it's more about God hears your prayer, and that's why we tend to say them out loud. Even if you mutter it to yourself, you've actually got to word for the prayer, not just think it. So God hears all prayers. It doesn't mean he answers it in the way that you want it answered. But we do make lots of jokes about, people that ask for stupid things and then don't. You have to help yourself. There's that one about the man is given the warning for the flooding and he doesn't do anything about it, and the floods come and somebody comes in the boat and he said, no, it's okay, God will look after me, and the flood gets worse, and then somebody comes in a helicopter, says, don't worry, God will look after me. Of course, he drowns. And he's out in heaven. And he said to God, but I thought you were going to look after it. He said, I sent you the warning. I sent you the boat. I sent you the helicopter. You have to listen back. You can't just sit there. and yeah. So you're meant to do things yourself and for each other. You can't just sit there like a child waiting for God to do everything. God is like a parental figure. We talk about God the King and God the Father, but we also have our own parents did that relationships. They are in place of God when we're on the planet. And by the time we're grown-ups, we are meant to be able to do everything. So God might hear, but doesn't. Sometimes we have to answer our own prayers. Judge ourselves.
I love that distinction you just made about us growing up. And because I think part of my worry about prayer, as sometimes I've seen it in the Christian tradition, is it almost infantilizes.
Right.
And I'm not going to cast aspersions on others, but I know myself that I've sometimes used that as a way of not really having to work with something, but just to hand it over to God as if that was somehow absolving me of then responsibility. But right. I love this idea of, to use the language of growing up and praying as an adult rather than praying as a child.
I guess it fits in with me as a scientist because my big thing is homeostasis, which is about self-maintenance. You're meant to maintain yourself. You're meant to stand on your own 2 feet. So there's different levels of charity. You can give begrudgingly to somebody on the street. And Maimonides listed all of them. And the highest level is to give somebody a job so that they don't need charity. What everybody needs to be is as independent and realize their potential. That's what we're all meant to do, find out who we're meant to be and what we're meant to do. But that's a grown-up independence that we're meant to have. We're not meant to be in the Garden of Eden. They were children in the Garden of Eden. And we're grown-ups, we're out of it. We have to look after ourselves now. And God's given us a formula, but we have to get up and do it. He's sent the warning, he sent the book, he sent the messages, he sent the prophets. Choose life, as we say. Here it is. So that's, for us to choose.
Yeah. Choosing life sounds a lovely way to sort of sum up. Would that be fair to say that from what I've been hearing in our conversation, you've been talking about choosing life, choosing gratitude, choosing to be thankful, choosing to open oneself up, and choosing to be part of community in prayer. Is that a fair assessment?
It's one of the most important things is to be awestruck. You should wake up awestruck that you're alive, and you should be in awe every day. That's why there's a prayer for everything. I'm in awe that I could wash my hands. I'm in awe and thankful for water. I'm in awe of everything. That's that sort of gratitude level that you're meant to be at. Don't take it for granted.
It sounds very much like practical theology being worked out in a different mode. And for me as a Christian, that however badly I pray or poorly or irregularly, or however I use the traditions and don't use the traditions, for me it is part of what it means to be a practical theologian, to somehow hold these difficult things of practice and huge questions about the world and politics, somehow to hold those that as I'm thinking about those as a practical theologian, it's not entirely separate from prayer. I'm not going to fool myself into thinking that it is entirely prayer, but there is a sort of overlap for me. I don't know about you.
Yes, I completely understand what you're saying. You can't separate yourself from what's going on around you, and you're trying to bring all of that into your understanding and your life and your world. And so, yes, and you're judging yourself all the time, and it's like a diary. You say at the end of the day, what did I do? Did I make it better? Did I make a difference? Was I more myself? Did I do what I was meant to do? It's a reflection time. I guess. And that's what we grown-ups have to do, is reflect and think, that school report could have done better. You think, actually, I'm not sure I could.
Yeah, introducing the metaphor of school reports into talking about prayer, I'm not sure I want to go that way.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
But thanks, Harrie. I've found that immensely personally stimulating. I hope our listeners have. And for everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And Harrie and I, perhaps others, will be back with other conversations of practical theology in due course. Bye for now.